Okay. It's the 20th. Jesus, time flies. You're having fun. Welcome to Weekly Marx. Today we will be hopefully more relaxed. My original plan was to read a little bit from Volume 1, the brand new Volume 1, which will probably, dominate the world for another decade. Um, maybe not. We'll see. This is the hegemony of English, of course. A Writer in North, brand new edition. And I was going to show, and I plan to show it, that is a Writer in North or a Writer in North. They've come out with a couple of videos. It's the book tour. There's the podcast that Princeton University Press has put out, and a couple of interviews that are an hour long. One more specifically with Deutsche House, which is every national language seems to have its own little. I wonder whether English has ever tried to do that. Maybe it does. I don't know. There are these little places that you can learn French or German that have they're like little embassies, as it were, and they serve an important purpose, as particularly in the United States, where we tend to think only people speak English. So, needless to say, I included the videos for both things. One is the introduction and two videos with the authors, which I may show at the end. Let me just do my little introduction here. As I said, there are three videos on this particular page that deal with the new Volume 1 translation, edited by Writer in North. I'm sure there'll be other associated things. It just came out in September, and for many people, it's a BFD because in some ways it's a little, I don't know if it's easier to read, but it is readable, and readable in the same sense that we're not kind of dominated by the kind of English or the editing of the Penguin editions, on the one hand. On the other hand, it's just simply more industry, I also wanted to point out that since we're this coming week, I expect a Andy Higginbottom lecture to come up, the lecture 8 of Reading Marx's Capital Volume 2, but I also wanted to make reference to, and because, Higginbottom also comments on Harvey's interpretation, and if you've suffered through Capital Volume 2 and Volume 3, Harvey has a particular position on it, which is critiqued by Higginbottom, but it's still necessary to sort of appreciate, I think, considering that David Harvey's cranked out one or two books a year, not all on Marx, but on issues related to late capitalism, and David Harvey's still worth reading. But he did a series, and this is the latest series, I think, the 12 video lectures. And you can see in the listing here how he skips around a little bit slightly in terms of chapters of Volume 2. And he goes to Volume 3 in the middle classes, so sort of obviating the need to do a Volume 3 set of videos. So all of that is, well, if you're into the minutiae of it, it's interesting to read that, and useful because of Harvey's particular interpretation of it. And it also sort of explains why he went back and did the Grundrisse again, because we do need to go back to the Grundrisse again, ultimately, regardless. And so, anyway, I included that, and I'm not sure why it's not coming up. I also included today, and if I can get this to play it, I'm not sure why it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing, is a thing that came out recently on Kamala Harris's father. and Marx after Marx. That's interesting. I included also the video of Heinrich himself, the preface to the introduction to the volumes of 1, 2, 3, which is worth listening to or reading because some of you have not been here since the beginning, where we did try and do the Heinrich introduction, which we may return to anyway, because Heinrich, I think, is important still to read, even though he has a certain place or position relative to the Paul's version of Volume 1. And I know this all may seem a little tedious. On the other hand, it can make you very popular at cocktail parties that you may have plowed through Volume 1, which I think in the Paul's version, there is an audiobook. I may decide to actually get it at some moment. I don't like audiobooks myself, having had to listen to the second or whatever it is Woodward book, Bob Woodward Trump book. I tried to listen to it in audio, and it just a little too tedious for my taste. I think audiobooks don't work really well for me, probably. Oh, well, long ones maybe. Let's put it that way. Anyway, there is an audiobook for Volume 2 of Capital, and it's the Penguin edition, and you may or may not want to listen to that as well at some moment, depending on how you like falling asleep. Anyway, so yes, it's come up here. Now they refresh the page. So there's an hour plus evening with Northern Writer, which we may listen to today, either that one or this one. And both of these just came out in the last couple of weeks. So these are all quite fresh. And of course, they're part of the promotion, as it were, of and this podcast, of course, which is Princeton University Press, promoting Capital Volume 1, the new translation. Unless you think that's unimportant, these translations have quite a shelf life, as you know from the Penguin edition, dog-eared, etc., that many of us have suffered through. So I included all of those, and is it not coming up? It should be right here. We go, and we will see if we can actually show this for the first 15 minutes. So I've given you the summary of the first page. The page of for the medium for Weekly Marx. I hope you will take advantage of some of these resources at your leisure. I think it is interesting to have a review in the last couple of weeks or couple of months of someone trying to review Donald Harris's book. I think it's also important in reflection on other matters that Harris never explicitly calls himself a Marxist, even though that's the Trumpian version of it. I mean, he does Marx stuff, but he also does he follows along in the history of post-war, neo-Ricardian thought. Is he's essentially following the same line that goes up through Ian Steedman of trying to make a more coded, as it were, and not explicitly Marxist, but something that really adjusts to the very specific elements about, well, as you can see here, growth, exploitation, and racism, which are ostensibly, when you start getting down to the applied version of this, particularly in the neo-Ricardian sense, you're talking about relation to property and land, the subsequent problems in the post-war period of trying to figure out, is what counts as a crisis, what counts as, the possibility of revolution, particularly in underdeveloped countries or the developed world or the global South, however you want to call it, and noting, of course, that Donald Harris consulted, with the government of Jamaica. I mean, very specifically with the government of Jamaica for a while, and towards the end of it, after he retired, I think he did a lot of work trying to actually, put into policy what many of the kinds of issues that come up in Marxist thought. So it's praxis occurs. He's not simply ivory tower Marxist, as Donald Trump might claim. So I'm going to try and let's see if we can see this.
She's a Marxist. Everybody knows she's a Marxist. Her father's a Marxist professor in economics, and he taught her well.
As Kamala Harris's presidential campaign kicks into high gear, much attention has been placed on her background. One of the focal points has been Harris's father, Donald J. Harris. It seems that, depending on who you ask, Donald Harris is an economist of one or the other heterodox flavors. On Wikipedia, he is described as a post-Keynesian, while elsewhere people have referred to him as a Marxist. None of these characterizations are wrong. Harris is a well-respected economist who has dedicated his career to critiquing mainstream economics and developing various strands of heterodox literature. What has generally lacked in the discourse surrounding Harris's career has been the actual content of his contributions. To that end, we will be taking some time in this video to go over a selection of Harris's published works. Before we do so, some important framing comments are needed. This video is not a comprehensive overview of Donald Harris's work. On the contrary, there is an obvious and transparent bias in the focus here. We are primarily interested in Harris's engagements with Marxism. This video is also not intended to be a commentary one way or another on Kamala Harris or her campaign. By discussing Donald Harris's work, we make no statements, supportive or otherwise, regarding the Harris-Walz presidential ticket. Ultimately, there is clearly little connection between Donald Harris's career and that of his daughter. More than anything, today's video is using the heightened attention to and press coverage of Kamala Harris's background to motivate an exploration of Donald Harris's work. With those points of clarification in mind, let's dive into some of Donald Harris's theoretical perspectives. One of Marx's more controversial propositions is that the functioning of the capitalist economy inescapably drives the general rate of profit down over a long time horizon. This prediction has been developed extensively both from theoretical and empirical perspectives. For a thorough coverage of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, see the video on our channel focusing on this topic. In brief, Marx predicted that competition among capitalists strongly pressured each of them to adopt technologies that replaced labor with capital. That is to say, technologies that increased the ratio of capital inputs relative to labor inputs. A capitalist that successfully implemented such a technology could undercut the competition and secure brief windfall profits, until the rest of the industry caught up with the new technique. Importantly, for Marx, new value could only be added by labor. Thus, by reducing the amount of labor used in production, the new technique reduced the new value created. The rate of profit being the ratio of new value created and the total value of capital and labor employed in production, the gradual shrinking of value added meant that the rate of profit would continually decline. Marx, of course, noted that there are many ways in which this dynamic pattern of labor cost saving could be counteracted, resulting in a constant or even increasing rate of profit. More details on those counterforces can be found in the Tendency of the Rate of Profit to Fall video. Since Marx, scholars have either argued for or against the existence of such a tendency. These arguments have been brought to the data, with some results indicating a clear fall in the overall profit rate, while others continuing to challenge the hypothesis. In the simplest terms, Harris argues that there is no a priori tendency in the increase or decrease of the rate of profit. Instead, these patterns are strongly dependent on context. Harris reminds us that there are different ways to think about the capital-labor ratio. There is the technical composition of capital, which looks only at the ratio of physical capital inputs and physical labor inputs. The value composition, however, looks at the labor value of capital over the labor value of labor power. He then shows us that labor-saving technological change can increase the machine use for every unit of output, but also decrease the labor value of that output. A lot ultimately rests on how the technological change has affected the overall economy. If the change reduces the value of the goods produced, then the value composition of capital does not necessarily increase. It's true that more capital is used to produce the output, but that capital's value may be unchanged or even decreased. Thus, the physical quantity of machines has grown, but the value of those machines may have decreased, such that the value composition of capital has remained the same. What does this mean for the rate of profit? The value of output has gotten smaller, but so has the value of the inputs needed to produce things. So, it is possible that the rate of profit has not changed at all. It may even be possible, under the right circumstances, for the rate of profit to increase. The main point Harris wants to make is that there is no guarantee that the competition-driven automation of production will change the composition of capital in value terms, and therefore exert a downward pressure on the rate of profit. It all depends on the kind of technical change occurring, in which sectors it occurs, and how important the sectors are to the rest of the economy. Harris stresses that the structure of a capitalist economy is such that society develops unevenly, which further complicates the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Adoption of a specific automation technique in one sector does not have a single determined effect on the overall profit rate. Another focus for Harris has been critiquing and developing theories of economic growth. For Harris, neoclassical, also known as mainstream growth models, have failed to explain how an economy expands over time. The older models, including the ones still taught in many undergraduate classrooms today, explain growth through outside factors such as an increase in the population or a change in technology. Essentially, growth occurs because something from outside the system shocks it positively. Harris aptly states that such exogenous growth models have no theory of growth at all. Moreover, the neoclassical framework has no conception of classes, focusing instead on individual households that supposedly make consumption decisions across a defined lifespan. Harris characterizes the neoclassical models as only seeking to answer the question of efficient allocation of resources in accordance with consumer preferences. Instead, Harris believes that a theory of growth should explain the expanded reproduction of the capitalist mode of production on a world scale. Harris then sketches a model based on Marx and Koletsky, where growth depends on the rate of exploitation, expected profit rates, and capitalist savings. Unlike the neoclassical model, Harris's model directly incorporates social mechanisms, namely class struggle and the balance between labor and capital. Moreover, the theory of growth is grounded in behaviors and interactions of distinct classes, as well as different technologies available to a given economy. In a different paper, Harris explores the unevenness with which capitalism tends to develop. Looking back to Marx, Harris models an economy with two sectors, one that produces the means of production, aka capital goods, and one that produces consumer goods. The question Harris is most interested in is what conditions must be met for both sectors to grow at the same pace. This type of growth is known as balanced growth, and is generally preferable for an economy as it ensures sustainable expansion. By contrast, if one sector outproduces the other, the economy risks entering a crisis where some of the produced surplus cannot be consumed. Harris demonstrates that balanced growth in capitalism necessarily requires redistribution of surplus value such that some capitalists gain at the expense of others. This relates somewhat to the scenario of unequal exchange, which is covered in a different video on this channel. The gist is that competitive forces equalize prices and rates of profit, while the actual values of produced goods are not necessarily equal between the producers and sectors. The result is that some capitalists sell their output at a below-value price, while others sell their output at an above-value price. This phenomenon can be thought of as the price mechanism redistributing value, in this case from one sector to another. In short, the Marxist model of capital accumulation predicts that balanced growth is possible, but only through the redistribution of surplus via the competitive price mechanism. Using the concept of value allows us to see that some portion of the social surplus is captured by a group of capitalists at the expense of others. Finally, let's look through some of Harris's views on the connection between racism and capitalism in the United States. An integral concept in this discussion for Harris is the notion of exploitation. Harris is careful to define exploitation specifically in Marxist terms, as he views the alternative understanding to be unsystematic and inadequately applicable. Whereas Marx's predecessors correctly identified exploitation as the process by which some of the social surplus created by one class of people was appropriated by a different class of people, they struggled to systematize their thinking. The marginalists, who came after Marx, simply disregarded exploitation altogether, except in the unique instance of a deviation from a theoretical equilibrium. Harris strongly prefers Marx's understanding of exploitation because it is well developed and does not limit itself to fringe cases as does the mainstream marginalist perspective. In fairly simple terms, exploitation describes the appropriation by capitalists of an excess amount of value which is embodied in the product of labor. In other words, because of their exclusive ownership of the means of production, capitalists get to keep the difference between the value produced and the value of the labor power paid out to workers in the form of wages. In his discussion of exploitation, Harris explicitly notes that the division of any working day into paid labor time and unpaid labor time is metaphorical. Harris stresses that only workers as a class can be thought of as producing a social surplus. In other words, dealing with all of these categories, the rate of exploitation, surplus labor time, surplus value, and so on, requires thinking in the aggregate, that is to say, at the social level. Because all the forces at play are systemic, it is best to treat the behavior of individuals as largely independent of their individual will and intention. As social beings, both workers and capitalists perform actions in correspondence with their class position in society. Workers will feel the drive to demand higher wages. Capitalists will feel the drive to put downward pressure on wages and other costs. This actually carries an important insight in the analysis of racism and capitalism. The implication is that capitalism carries with it certain intrinsic, impersonal mechanisms that can make use of and perpetuate racial discrimination. Harris goes on to ask whether black labor is more exploited than other labors. This question is left unanswered because, according to Harris, speaking of specific rates of exploitation is as misleading as splitting up an individual's working day into paid and unpaid labor. There is not a good way to measure the rate of exploitation, since it is meant to be understood on a much broader social level. But it is worth, in Harris's opinion, to ask how the concrete conditions of exploitation might differ between black and white labor. This is something that can be discussed and understood because we can observe black labor being situated in different locations in the production system, consuming different use values, possessing different strengths of organization and militancy, and experiencing overall different historical conditions of development. Moving towards black history in the United States, Harris explains that slavery was, in fact, a kind of primitive accumulation for the black population, in that it forcefully separated black communities from any ownership of the means of production. Thus, slavery was the contextual condition from which black labor emerged in American capitalism. This has, of course, structured the ways in which black labor fits into the U.S. economy. The division of labor in the U.S. has historically taken on a racial or ethnic character. Black labor, for instance, has generally been relegated to the low-wage sectors, usually requiring the execution of strenuous activities or working in more hazardous environments. What appears to be most important for Harris in this discussion is the role of black labor in the so-called reserve army of the unemployed. Recalling the earlier ideas on capital accumulation, the competition that characterizes capitalist economies necessitates a type of innovation process that continually throws workers out of employment. Indeed, the system as a whole relies heavily on this regulation of the employment level, such that the existence of a pool of unemployed people is integral to capitalist growth and stability. This reserve army of laborers, ready to take a job at much lower wage rates than their employed counterparts, also helps control the growth of wages. Racist institutions in American history have, in turn, ensured that the black working class has disproportionately restocked the reserve army. Harris frequently asserts that capitalism is a system that develops unevenly. Rather than being a deviation from some ideal form, this quality of capitalism has always been one of its defining features. capitalism relies on unevenness to extract additional surpluses and minimize costs. The black population in the United States has been a crucial source of cheap labor, while racism has fractionalized the working class in a way that has depressed overall wages. The basic point, Harris argues, is that black people are, and have always been, organically linked with American capitalism from its very beginning. It is clear from our discussion that Harris is deeply involved in various strains of Marxist scholarship. Nonetheless, it would be wrong to place him within the orthodoxy of Marxist tradition. In many of his published articles, Harris has problematized central features and predictions of Marxist thinking. Moreover, we did not review the large proportion of Harris's work, which is best described as post-Keynesian rather than Marxist, although there is a notable overlap between the two. What then can we say about Harris's intellectual position? Harris is an economist who has taken a consistent and serious stance against the mainstream perspectives of his profession, drawing on diverse traditions to shed light on radical messages. One of Harris's chief concerns is the question of how capitalism as a system functions, which necessarily involves studying the macro-level patterns of distribution and capital accumulation. For Harris, answering this question necessarily requires examining power dynamics between classes, exploitation, and the destructive tendencies of capitalist competition. We can therefore say that the right-wing insinuations are completely well-founded. Harris is indeed a radical economist, precisely because he has chosen to dedicate his intellectual contributions to the study of capitalism as it actually is, and not through abstract models that do away with class, race, uneven development, exploitation, and inequality.
Okay. Let's see where we. Now that hopefully that is actually provides clarity. And in fact, one can actually address that if you're talking to some right-wing person. And I would hope that that was useful. And in fact, I find that actually quite expressive in the sense that one needs to talk about some of the precise issues. And you don't have to talk about Marx. You can just simply talk about post-Keynesianism, which is usually the way in which people frame it anyway, just to get out of the whole problem of trying to explain it. Let me just say that we're almost at the end of our time. And let me bring this back and leave you with a sort of taste of talking with the Pauls, because probably we'll have to do that when we look at the text itself in reproduction. As I said, for those who came in late, Volume 2 is continuing. I assume that the Andy Higginbottom lecture is coming up, and which will help move us through that. I've included today some resources to support that idea, but simultaneously, because of the publication of the Pauls, Paul Ryder and Paul North's book, it's worth just simply speaking with them about these matters. So let's try and look at a few minutes of this, and then we can stop.
So nice to see faces that I recognize from NYU and elsewhere, and I'm thrilled to welcome Paul N. and Paul R. This is an incredible work. We were chatting just before, and I confessed that last night the book fell off my night table onto my glasses, and I had to get my glasses readjusted this morning. So we know that this is a killer of a book. This is really
You're supposed to read it anyway, not throw it.
well, it has to. I'm going to start with a very general question to both of you about the genesis of the project, what sparked the new translation. Was it a collective process of work? I mean, I'm assuming it is. And also just to as a little comment, translation is a very special, particular, oblique, transversal, cut through theory. It produces its own weird effects. So take that with will. Yeah.
Maybe we'll test and see if Ryder can speak to us. Do you want to start?
I think I'm unmuted. Can you can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Working? Excellent. Okay. Well, I'm a little raspy. Sorry. And in addition to that, I have a tendency to prattle on when I'm on Zoom, so I'm going to really try to rein myself in and
Also in person.
err on the side of brevity. So if you want more, just let me know, and I'll pick up where I left off. But I'm going to try to again keep things very economical here. So there were a lot of roads to this project for me. One of them was the classroom. I had been teaching capital for many years, and being interested in translation, being a translator myself, I did a lot of backseat driving as I was teaching these translations of Marx to students who didn't have German. And I kept, I don't have much of a do-it-yourself streak, but when it comes to translation, that's sort of an exception. I kept thinking, well, you know, somebody should do a new translation that conveys things that the existing translations don't convey. And eventually I thought, okay, I'll try it myself. I have enough in the way of preparation. I mean, nobody is really ever qualified to do this, but I have enough so that it doesn't feel completely ludicrous to give it a try. That's on the very micro level of the classroom. And then, of course, there were other things going on in the world, resurgent interest in Marx, which was exciting, developments in Marx scholarship that made a new translation seem that much more necessary, developments in the critical edition of Marx and Engels' complete works in Germany, this massive project that made available all kinds of materials that were extremely useful to us. And so all these things played a role as well. I suppose there's also the matter of midlife, you know, wondering whether you're up to a challenge like this still. I'm going to stop there and let Paul give his perspective.
Well, one of the theorizations that doesn't happen so much around translation is what the translation does to the translator. This one is a little bit like swallowing an elephant. And it's amazing how well put together Ryder is after this. Really was. First of all, I'll just say a few laudatory things about him after making fun of him. This translation brings you Marx's lightness. You wouldn't have known that from the previous translation, especially. Marx's humor, Marx's irony. Ryder's a very ironic guy. And he could hear all the ironies in Marx, so they come through really amazingly. I think it was a big education for both of us swallowing this elephant. It's just enormous, and it has every possible style in it. So if you specialize in Dostoevsky, I don't know, maybe there's 3 styles in Dostoevsky. Is Dostoevsky flat? Maybe a little bit. I don't know, maybe not. But Marx has 20. He tells jokes when you least expect it, like the commodity that's being sold through the first few chapters is the Bible. What do they sell it for? To buy schnapps. This comes through a lot better in this translation. And I think it brought to us, it made us into critics of capital in a way that we weren't before, and particularly because of the scholarship that changes the reading of the first 4 chapters. That is the scholarship called value theory. It was really important for us in doing this. It seems to be the breakthrough that brought everyone back to Marx's non-revolutionary project, taking this book and making it. So here's the theory. Translation of this book, after a lot of really interesting work on it, teaches you that it really doesn't lead to revolution. Sorry to say. I think of it as the most pessimistic book ever written. And that does something to you when reading it. You begin to see there's no way out.
Okay. We'll come back to that. Another question is, did you see this project as similar to comparable, fairly recent attempts to unseat standard editions. I'm thinking of Adam Phillips's Penguin Freud with the different translators. And they non-standardized what had been the Strachey standardization of ego, id, superego. They played around with that. Or Christopher Prendergast's Penguin Proust, which also used different translators. So was there almost a kind of a plan here and you mentioned the literary, and Keston Sutherland in his book called Stupefaction, which has some very interesting comments on Marx's jargon, and he reads it as as a work of literature, as a satire. It's a form of satire. He says that people constantly miss that. And you mentioned, both of you, that you were sensitive to the humor and to the ironies and to, there are incredibly rich notes in this edition, just so you know that it could be like a separate book, and you'll make some little rabbit hole comment like about a phrase which I wouldn't have picked up at all, that is a Goethe quote from the Elfkönig, which is this amazing, if you haven't listened to it, is it Schubert's version? Listen to it on YouTube tonight. And this set me off into one of these ecstasies of association. But the point is that people weren't, part of the interest of this slightly unstandard approach is to really bring out the voicings that you just mentioned, the style, the variation of style, and also this incredible asides and wealth of literary reference. So anything you might want to say about that?
Well, I follow the Freud retranslation project a bit more carefully than the Proust project. And I suppose that in some ways, the circumstances here might be a little bit more favorable because the Freud standard translation, which everybody talks about as the standard translation, is this really revered thing. And if you read Adam Phillips' essay in the London Review of Books, where he talks about the various strategies that he cooked up for this project, there's a lot of pressure there, it seems, to avoid taking on the standard edition directly. And one wouldn't want to do that. One wouldn't want to question its value, its greatness. So we need to do something else. We need to be different all the time. And the existing English editions of translations of Capital, I have considerable respect for, but I don't think that they have anything like the status of the Strachey translation of Freud. And so it was a bit engaging them in conversation, felt a bit freer for me. And there were also, as I said, there were some things that felt fairly straightforwardly necessary in a way that maybe Phillips, it wasn't so much the case with Phillips. At least that's not what I get from his introduction. So there were, in the existing English translations of Capital, there are some areas of conceptual imprecision. And that to me feels like a significant problem. It doesn't make them bad translations, but it makes it more difficult to follow the development of Marx's concepts as he unfolds the value form. And that's an important thing right now for readers of Marx. And so if you can make the conceptual architecture more precise in a translation, that's a fairly compelling justification for new translation. I don't think that Phillips had something like that. And so it felt, again, a little less difficult to proceed here than I think it was for Phillips. And I think as a result...
Am I cutting you off?
Well, I just wanted to say one last thing. Now you all know what I was talking about when I said that I have a tendency to prattle on when I'm on Zoom, but I'm going to just say one very quick last thing. And, I as far as I can tell, the retranslations of the Freud works overseen by Phillips have not been hugely successful.
Are you done?
I'm done.
I
Thank
want
you.
to add only something about this book, which is surprising given how much people refer to it, and revolutions have been thought to some degree in reference to it. The Latin American philosopher Enrique Dussel once calculated that this book was about 1/72 of the Capital Project material. So different than the Freud texts, which were completed for publication. This was completed for publication, but he went on revising it for another 15 years in notes, in a French translation. And even inside of the text, although he's looking for something like you could call a scientific vocabulary, a terminology, it's very much information while he's talking. So he'll call things value form, and then he'll call them form of appearance. And you don't know how appearance exactly fits with value form. The prose unfolds, and you can elucidate it by work. But he had not got there to a fixed vocabulary. And I think what happened with the translation that was made at the time of the New Left for certain political purposes, and what happened with the reception of it, especially in people like Harvey, I'll mention him, very good reader of Marx, really interesting character, but the terms really ossified. And they are not ossified here. Marx is looking for the way to do this and wasn't always sure that he had got the right words, that he had got the right phenomena. The reports were coming in. He was constantly reading to correct himself.
Fantastic. So yes, we've been talking about editions. So just for the audience's interest, there was a Moore Aveling, Samuel Moore and Edward Aveling translation from 1887. Aside, Aveling was a pretty dastardly guy who, and they left out Eleanor Marx,
All right,
the
let me
daughter.
stop there.
who
We
worked
can go
on
down a
this.
rabbit hole. It's we could say that this is incredibly technical, and perhaps there's some comments or reactions to this. No, yes.
I was
Prattling on.
appreciating it. Yeah, prattle on, brother.
Let me stop share. We can discuss this if you like. Are there questions, comments?
Well, I was reading that you had posted a lecture reference in the Discord from an anarchist, and I was reading through that, and I was curious, what the anarchist comment is on Marxism. Like is there a reconciliation of the two anywhere?
Well, I think it's important to look at the history of this. Of course, it goes back to 1870, essentially. What is the difference between anarchist views and Marxist views of things? And you can see that Marxists or certain types of socialists, were emphasizing class differences, etc. Anarchists, and sort of and with all due respect, are less interested in class, except that it is a way of getting, achieving, social change. But class becomes less of an issue. Not that it is reduced down to individuals, but rather it's sort of about the structure of the state. Ultimately, when you have to parse through all the different viewpoints, you get to, the moment where anarchists are impatient. Marxists, are more patient, perhaps. And it's not simply a matter of tactics or strategy, but rather, a kind of worldview that is not dissimilar. That is, it is about liberating individuals ultimately in the larger social context. The issue between the two is simply ultimately it's just the structure of the state when you get right down to it. I mean, in terms of the history of anarchist thought and the history of socialist thought or Marxist thought, they're not that dissimilar. It's just that there's a certain moment at which, history intervenes, and it's a lot easier to do certain things because you have a state sort of able to instrumentalize a lot of things that you couldn't do before, control of the state, that is. And that's why Leninism still remains important in the history of all of this, even though anarchists were repressed and suppressed by various versions of socialists, right? Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, that helps. I was sort
I mean,
of,
you could, well, let me make a last point. You could argue, if you were looking at Rosa Luxemburg's work, for example, that her desire to minimize issues of reform as opposed to supporting certain ideas of revolution, clearly about anarchism, or an anarchist necessity for action. And that theme remains with us. It doesn't mean that you can't or shouldn't read Rosa Luxemburg and on accumulation and imperialism and all that stuff. It's just that you need to have that sit in context with the way world history has moved.
yeah. Well, yeah, and maybe it's a similar perspective. Maybe it just sort of differs a little on where the focus of power is
Yeah.
exercised, I guess.
Well, and if you go to Marx specifically, it is about the some people ignore for whatever reason. If you're a Leninist, the withering away the state doesn't seem as possible as it should be, but it must be if, from a Marxist point of view. State's got to wither away too, just like
Yeah,
capitalism got to wither away.
yeah,
The goal of anarchism is no different in that sense. It's just that how fast you get there, and that's about accelerationism ultimately. Still, um,
mm-hmm.
it's unfortunate because you want to reconcile your own actions within your lifetime and blah 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 blah. But
Yeah,
sometimes you think, well, it's not going to be in my lifetime, maybe in my kid's lifetime or whatever. So it's not irreconcilable. It just you have to look at that. There's a foundation that it shares, and it's historically located, and it has certain tendencies, some of which appear anarchistic. You could say the entire Luxembourgian sort of approach is embodied in a variety of certain socialist subgroups. I like thinking it that way simply because it seems to be organized that way. But then you have other people, taking on other kinds of ideological issues about Trotsky and internationalism and permanent revolution and blah, blah, blah. And it just gets a little stupid after a while. I think you have to be much more pluralistic about the overall project, noting, of course, that history will, ultimately get there. I have a few comments that I want to make before I end on why the Paul's project, that is Writer in North project, is good, and why it does relate to the commentary on Donald Harris. So I just want to mention that before we stop.
yeah, please.
So no, your response though, do you have does that make sense though?
Yeah, yeah. I sort of, was keeping them unnecessarily separate, socialism and anarchism. I think, yeah, that they have this common uh, sort of foundation makes sense to me now.
Anarchists want the state that, they want that communist state. A communist
And
state has no state.
right, right, yeah.
And communists would agree with you. But, it's getting them to agree to that and getting it implemented always seems to be a little problematic.
Yeah, I can't even figure out what to call myself sometimes.
Oh, well, it really is difficult. But as I tried to make fun of, the last time, the difference between the People's Front of Judea and the Judean People's Front, that's where we are. And of course, there are people who are in radical groups who get really irritated when you point that out, the Monty Python play on it, but in fact, it lingers.
It's a thing, yeah.
You know, I mean, I don't find a problem with, for example, the Democratic Socialists, because ultimately they are making comments about the state, but it is, in the bigger picture, just an intermediate step. Democratic socialism is a step to socialism, which is a step to communism.
Well, maybe
And
that's what. Go ahead.
and people in DSA, some people who are, whatever, have thought through this a little bit more, actually hold that position. They don't mind, being in DSA and calling themselves communists. That doesn't seem to be, at problematic. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's part of the answer to my question I keep asking about what it means to solidaire.
Oh, well, that's a different question. It is about what is to be done. It is, we've seen a century and a half of those kinds of issues. And, I mean, as you get older, you begin to see, oh, that didn't get solved there, didn't get solved there. It's still screwed up over there. No, I try not to worry about it, because if you just obsess about it too much, you get into real crazy kind of theoretical conundrum. The China course, for example, is really useful because it does remind us that you still have a socialist state operating ostensibly, and the big difference in post-war Chinese thought is essentially about markets.
Mm. Well, yeah, I really like that. What they started with yesterday about this, how many people were sort of lifted out of abject poverty.
Yes. It's a significant number. It is, and it fits theoretically. It's not simply, well, we've got to remove people from poverty. It is the essence of Maoism to develop the peasantry. It is that break between among classes that Mao is acutely aware of. It is the only reason why, the Long March works. It is the reason why the communists succeeded.
Right. Yeah. That was a key choice to go to the rural people.
But it was logical. It wasn't cynical. It's just that, the four, whatever it is, dicta. There's like this little set of 4 things and 8 things, which mimics the Buddhists. But anyway, it is the idea that, you are polite to everyone, you respect everyone's property, which is really no different than a certain type of Confucianism anyway. And that's how you proceed in a military way. And that's kind of, how the Long March works. You don't pillage, in other words. It's sort of the anti-pillage rule.
Right.
But it's very different between how the communists, and from a disciplinary point of view, from a disciplined military force, than it is from the Kuomintang, the right wing, who didn't give a shit about, whether you were going to pillage or not. You just pillage, or, whatever. You just don't give a shit about people. And I think it is that the Marxian questions that kept the People's Republic, viable. Similarly, the lifting people out of poverty is actually a really important point. I mean, it is important from a developmental economics point of view that is capitalist, essentially, but it also is about a commitment to the peasantry, which goes all the way as a through line into basic Chinese communism.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it seems to me it's like, it had this more pure sort of origins and past, but now it runs the risk of getting co-opted by capitalism more,
Well, it has other cultural problems, the People's Liberation Army is the People's Liberation Army, and it's not the same as the Soviet approach to the Red Army. It really is much more located within the context of people's rule, as opposed to the Russian approach to these matters. I would say that's one of the fundamental differences. But it's ethnocentric and at its very basis. So that's another problem, you know.
Oh, right, yeah. Well, yeah, I guess you learn along the way, little bit by little bit.
Well, you know, that's kind of history at work. So anyway, let me close because I'm running over time. Let me say that the Donald Harris video was, for me, very good because it structured the arguments really clearly and carefully relative to value, surplus value, etc. But the question of value and capital as metaphoric, which relates to the idea of abstract labor and value form and all those other things, the metaphoric thing is what connects that Harris piece to talking with the Pauls about North and Rudder about volume 1 of Capital, is that there is it does exist at this abstract level, and it is why it has survived. That it's not simply a mathematical model. It is a humanist model. It is one that addresses a variety of things that go beyond the marginalist critique, all these other things, and that's what makes it still important. Is that we need to work through certain things at an abstract level, which is okay for people who study it primarily as a philosophy, but at some moment, as a philosopher, you also have to get back down to it is about actual numerical elements as well as trying to explain it in a way that makes it attractive to, as I've explained before, is that Marx is working, unlike anarchists, with a specific kind of class problem that is important for his time. That is the working class, trade unions, all that stuff. It's really important. It's right in front of you. You have to sort of deal with it. And it shows maybe an overemphasis on that, but he did forget about all the other things. All the other things were there going on too. It's just that, this week, we can't explain all of this math and science stuff. It's really important about just talking about working people and, the vote and other things. That's kind of the dual nature of trying to be a cultural worker within this context. It's a Gramsci's problem. So anyway, that's my closing point. Larry, if you want to make some other closing points, then I'll stop. Our anarchists just need to redirect power away from the point just before the dictatorship of the proletariat raises. Yes, that's precisely the point. It's to work through some of these things that are clearly linguistic. I mean, a dictatorship of the proletariat means something different in the 21st century than in the 19th century. And people need to get with that. It's unfortunate that if I were having an argument with people in the right wing, they would say, well, dictatorship of the proletariat, you're obviously into authoritarian rule and blah, blah, blah. No, not. I'm just saying that, people power is more important than, autocrat power. That's pretty much it.
Well, I did really appreciate hearing about, Kamala's dad. This gives, a little more context to her.
Yes.
I don't suppose she would ever, I don't know, do something along the lines of Marxism, but we'll see. I guess.
Well, we're just waiting for this election to be over. I'm sure Dad will come to the White House at some moment.
Yeah.
Dad will be in the fucking White House at some moment. Not a signal to us about anything particular, but it would just be useful to have him there. I mean, the problem is you can be very literate about these things. If you read the biographic material by Barack Obama, he knows all this shit. He just, he's in a place where he can't do anything about it.
Mm.
Do you think Donald Harris will be at the inauguration?
Oh, I'm sure he will be.
Wow.
Well, I mean, he's dad, I mean,
Yeah.
despite the
But they
divorce,
had a fight.
what, Kamala and her father? I don't think so.
No, okay, great.
I thought there was always a reconciliation. It's just as simply that, dad doesn't want to get involved talking about the politics because obviously, as you can see, it's a bad message. That's all. And they got divorced, way early.
Right.
I mean, there was no substitute, and that's interesting for all kinds of interesting feminist reasons.
Yeah.
But whatever, however you want to read it.
Wow.
I mean, it's nice that we get to revisit some of his work because it is important where it fits in the kind of history of post-Keynesian, neo-Ricardian, blah, blah, blah. But, and it's not irrelevant in that sense. It actually is foundation. It's part of the larger foundation. There are a bunch of people who wrote stuff about this. So it's not like he's, Einstein or anything. It's just simply that it fits in an intellectual tradition that is not over. Let's put it that way.
Mm. Fun
And we're not being
times.
apologists about it. I mean, I think that he, the way this little fragment, describes his set of ideas, it is still the same idea that is being struggled through with eco-socialism or whatever. All of those same ideas are still at work. The problems of capital labor, the rate of profit, the organic composition of capital, which is what essentially we're talking about there. It's all still there. I mean, the issue is you can't use it as the only, or you can't reify it. You can't say it's the only means by which we can frame the post-Keynesian arguments.
Mm.
You have to just sort of see it in this context. And yes, there's math that goes with it. Oh, Lane has asked an interesting question. How does socialist libertarianism differ from anarchy? I don't think it differs much at all. I would say that socialist libertarianism does determine on a certain state, relies on a certain state structure to ensure the rights of individuals. And anarchy, with all due respect to the Enlightenment, assumes that as individuals, we can all be very purely self-regulated, that we're all smart enough not to do stupid shit. Whereas social libertarianism would say, well, they're still idiots, and we still need a certain rule of law. Socialist libertarianism would rely on the thing that Nozick starts about, is about at what state is the minimalist state, the libertarians' watchman state, so-called watchman state. At what moment can it dissolve? Can it disappear? Because it should. I mean, I think it should.
Yeah. I often mention about our inner Hitler, and I oftentimes also forget that, if we've got an inner Hitler, then we've got an inner, the opposite of that too.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and we need to reconcile that. I mean, there's stuff I would love to see happen, and I can't do it as an individual. I can't probably do it as a matter of the masses. I probably need a state to do it. And that's problematic to me. It's always a problematic thing.
Yeah.
I mean, you could talk about any policy matter, gun control. They're just stuff that shows that the state is can be a real problem. The abortion thing is clearly about misuse of state power. And yet,
Yeah.
on the other hand, the liberal version of it also has its own issues as well. Not quite as stupid, obviously, and ignorant as the Christian nationalist version of it, but it's sort of there.
Wow.
I mean, I don't make this stuff up. It's there, right? We have literature. There's Handmaid's Tale is fairly recent when you think about literature, and it is it does describe exactly the kind of the fascism that's going on at the present moment.
Whew.
So anyway, let me stop this and we can go back.